What's up guys, it's Willie and welcome back to another video. And now we're talking about the recently completed season of Australian Survivor Redemption. So likewise, for this review, unlike most cases where I would describe as much details in every episode, I decided to let go of that and just talk more generally throughout every episode in brief. So likewise, I'm going to go episode by episode and by the end give my final thoughts on the season and obviously do a little rating on who is the best and worst player of the season. Australian Survivor Redemption begins with a cast of 20 new players who are joined by 4 returnees, as well as encountering the show's new host, former winner David. And many people, upon learning of this news, were infuriated that the show would let go of JLP, and I personally was always going to be on that side of it, because JLP's hosting felt like a very big charm to the franchise, and for him to be just essentially snuffed out like that was just a shame. And so coming into the season with David as new host was just sort of a different feeling that did not give me the hype. However, I'll say David was just fine as a host, has come to his own. So there are some nitpicks with like some of his dialogue, and also at Tribal, specifically when he's reading out the votes, I don't really like how he shakes the parchment as he's revealing them, which is not what JLP would do, as he's more static with the parchment as he flips them over. Now I understand this is David's first time hosting the show, so I do hope that he can reflect on the fundamental flaws that he made this season and improve on them. But with that said, let's dive right into the season. Anyways, diving into the season, the 24 players are divided into 2 tribes of 12, where they compete in the first reward challenge to officially earn the name of their tribes, which would be Bounty and Baron, something that we are familiar with back in that twist in Brains vs. Brawn 2. But anyway, to talk generally, the premiere starts off okay with us getting a very foolish downfall for Daniel, all because he kept getting names mixed up when someone like Richard was the prime target. Then we get into episode 2, where I haven't mentioned, but the likes of like Johnson and Kat came from previous reality shows in like BBAU, in Traders and Z, and boy, they didn't translate well on Survivor, as both ended up being a train wreck. Well, Johnson at first, until Kat at Tribal, for unnecessary reasons, just start to stir things up with Johnson at Tribal, causing Mark to flip the votes on her and send her out, which is genuinely insane. And then to episode 3, which is definitely the lesser of the 3 episodes, but we do get a wall downfall for Eliza, all because she was right with her idea, trying to bond with Lyndall about being on the bottom, but only for Lyndall's delusion to completely sink her game. Then for week 2, the season does continue to stay competent, where we get to episode 4 and most of the stuff happening is obviously on the Bounty tribe. We do get this somewhat wild downfall for Paula of all players, which was done to weaken Harry. Which, in speaking of episode 5, a lot of stuff went down with Bounty losing once again, but Asha, who happened to find an advantage in her cake in the previous reward, would save Laws with it and then pick Kayla from Baron to join their respective tribal. On top of that, the Bounty would compete for individual immunity, where Lyndall would win, leaving Jackson and Harry at the bottom, and while Harry comes up with this very elaborate plan of blackmailing the players not to vote them out or the Flint goes, Jackson ultimately pulls off a very deceptive play and betrays him right on the spot at Tribal, which caused the votes to flip and get rid of Harry, making him the first returnee voted out. And the mess doesn't stop here when we get to episode 6 with Baron finally losing again, and Johnson seemed like the dead man walking, though there was a plan from Faith and Keely to try and flip the votes on Caleb, but ultimately the plan didn't go through and Johnson still ended up being the boot. Week D, the season does partially slow down, but we retrain a lot of this week to the swap, where, let's cut to the chase, the entire tribal council centered around the new Baron because they pretty much sucked at all the challenges. But starting with episode 7, it was a pretty wild scramble with Sally being Mark's prime target, but then Keely decided to be shifty and pull a stealth move to blindside Dawn at the last second, which she actually pulled it off, which is so impressive. And also, it's Dawn who goes out, who happens to be Matt Rogers' older brother. So then to episode 8, which was just finer for the most part, but new Baron with an obvious tribal alliance in play with Lyndall and Richard on the bottom. The vote ends up going on Lyndall, and meanwhile Tez has his own plans, but his alliance just doesn't trust him, and ultimately he ends up being left out as Lyndall is blindsided. And also to know that she initially found a shared idol with Brooke, which was only limited before the swap, but for some reason the editors made us think that she still had one when she really didn't, so I think that was pretty dumb on their part. Anyways, to episode 9, which was kind of a slower episode, where we do get a twist where both tribes go to tribal, but it ends up being like last season where it's only one tribe who's voting someone off and 2 people elected must face off in a fire making challenge, which ultimately new Baron loses because they can't win anything. And likewise with Tezgod, my man, being so mistreated by his allies, they look at him as a liability and sent him home. Then for week 4, which probably is one of the best stretches of episodes, where we get 2 glorious downfalls of big players. So we start with episode 10, where it's just this fantastic downfall for Asha, even herself throwing the challenge that indirectly sealed her fate. And on top of that, leaving with Blanche's idol that she had found. So that was a nice cherry to top off this Sunday. And yes, the episode did also air on the day of Sunday as well. But then to the following episode, where we finally got the anticipated non-elimination episode, and the only one for the season, which was quite frankly for the better in such a significant way. But yeah, we end up having the likes of Caleb, Keely, and Sally head to Redemption Beach, leading us to the following episode with Redemption Peach only playing a very small impact. It doesn't have any sort of elimination ramifications, which was fine enough for me. I mean, I wouldn't want someone like Keely to get screwed over all because she got one vote. But either way, Caleb wins the challenge, leaving Keely and Sally in basically a downgrade situation where they'll head to whichever tribe loses immunity and don't have a say in the vote either. So anyways, New Bounty loses, and this is where Mark finally makes his big move and flips on Faith, which was purely insane. But also a bit of the right move, as Faith and Keely were also planning to snipe at him too, so his mind eventually caught wind of something like that and took the missile first. And that leaves us off with a pretty insane week of the likes of Asha and Faith being sniped out back to back. Next up for week 5, and another competent week with a couple crazy tribal councils, and this is also pertaining to finally the merge phase of the game. So starting with episode 13, which does start off on a bit of a timid pace where, I mean, we do have the eventual boot of Lottie, who was such a big player in the pre-swap phase of the game, but ultimately you are no match for Keely. So then to episode 14, which was definitely a lot more of a chaotic episode, where Ben out of nowhere comes out of the shadows and starts leading the charge against the returnees plus Keely, and Mark is the prime target, but thankfully for him, he had an idol that he found a few rounds ago, and he ultimately played a successful idol, and during the scrambling at Tribal, his group ends up targeting Richard for some reason, because I guess he wasn't being receptive. You know, it's all in all just questionable when you could have literally taken out Ben in this spot, who was clearly the leader of the new rebellion grouping, but either way, a chaotic Tribal that leads to the blind side of Rich. And then finally to episode 15, with the minority grouping trying to flip someone over, and they were close to getting Caleb, who was wavering between voting Ben and Mark, but ultimately he ends up blindsiding Mark, sending another big player and a returnee out of the game. Week 6 would be another fun week, with so many blindsides and betrayals that sort of goes to historic levels. So for episode 16, we have the last two returnees plus Keely on the bottom, but Keely had thankfully found an idol for herself, and on top of that, during her time on Redemption Beach, she carved off one of the symbols on the box that resembled the medallion of an idol, and with some help of art and crafts, she made it as realistic and gave it to Brooke, and this was so creative. And on top of Simon having one immunity, it made the majority start to scramble hard on who they're willing to sacrifice, with Ben taking the lead against Blanche because she's such a liability to the group, and when all the shenanigans happens at Tribal, Keely ends up playing her idol on Brooke, and with the split votes on Blanche, and then ends up setting her own. So then to episode 17, what could have been a very straightforward episode ends off having probably one of the most wildest results yet, where it seemed like Brooke was a goner after Simon won another immunity, and with votes being split on Keely, it was essentially needed for one more vote to flip, and the group tried their best to get Jackson, literally Ben's number 1, but he seemed reluctant prior to Tribal, but it seemed at the very last second in the voting booth, he ends up flipping and blindsiding his number 1 Ben from the game, which still had me shell-shocked after the insanity that just went down. So then to episode 18, which was another fun ride, though the booth can be looked at as foreseeable, as once Simon lost immunity, he was for sure the other side's target, and sure enough he was. And while his side does try to tie up the numbers with them targeting Laws, Brooke ultimately flips at the very last second because I guess she just wanted to open up the competition, care for herself, even though as we saw how the season played out didn't really work in her favor. Like, there was not really any merit to just letting go Simon here, especially if he was willing to take you far. But yeah, this was pretty much a shocking farewell to Simon once again. Then move on to week 7, and honestly, this is probably the more lamer weeks of the season, with the last two in particular just being such foregone conclusion and kind of slow down the pacing of the season. Though we can start off with episode 19, where it was pretty much this foreseeable defeat for Cameron, as even his own allies turned against him and voted him out. And then to episode 20, which was definitely a lot more sombering episode, where Brooke finally meets her demise after screaming Wi-Fi so long, but ultimately Keely even turns on her, which eventually leads to her being the last return voted out. And then lastly to episode 21, which continues to be more sombering as we eventually lose Keely as well, and that was more devastating to me as I absolutely loved her role on the season, being a very stealthy player, and those are the kind of strategies that I personally like seeing. But ultimately Keely herself was outplayed by Sally, who for some context found a half idol that Brooke found, who eventually passed it to Keely, and while Keely was under the impression that Sally would work with her, she ended up getting played, and that alone was the nail to her coffin, putting an end to her amazing journey this season. And then to the finale week, which was, I'll say, a bit by the numbers, but at least we kept sustaining the thrill out of it. So starting things off with episode 22, Jackson seems like a dead man walking if he doesn't win immunity, and what do you know? He wins immunities! So now the so-called underdogs are now having to turn against each other, and while Jackson and Sally try to push for a Caleb boot, Laws doesn't budge and ends up voting with him to take out Sally, which ends up in a tie and leading to us into a fire making which Caleb easily dominates and Sally is officially eliminated in that spot. Then we get to episode 23, where where it's the final 3 challenge, and Caleb ends up winning, and what felt like was going to be an easy choice of him taking Laws to the end, well, that wouldn't be the case for both the jury and the audience, as there was no real setup to his change of mind, and when Thayer reads out Laws' name, it just sparks so much reaction that ultimately makes for great TV because of the unpredictability of it. So Laws is out, and now we have a final 2 of Jackson and Caleb, which we get to the finale, and the entire episode pertains to the final tribal and reunion, which was so refreshing to see, considering the complete apathy I have for the US after shows. Though I'll say this reunion was just kinda lackluster, but whatever. We get to the winner reveal, where it was clear cut that Caleb was gonna win, despite Jackson putting up a pretty strong pitch, but either way, Caleb pulls out the victory and is the winner of Australian Survivor Redemption. And on top of that, David announces that the show is gonna be returning next year on a new location in Malaysia, which good. I'd like to see some difference in scenery, unlike US, which is always just being stuck in Fiji. Well, that's the season for you, and this one had no right to be as good as it is. You know, coming into it, I had completely had no hype for it, simply because of the fact that Survivor 50 was kind of the more exciting season for me, and I'm still at least liking it. So I'll say these past few weeks have been a bit frustrating for me, while this season just blew my mind as we progressed throughout and constantly stayed consistent and competent with such dynamic gameplay and very little stagnant portions that make this definitely, I will say, a top 5 season of AU Survivor for sure. Like in most ways, I obviously would look at this better than Brains vs. Brawn 2, which I've gone on to say how its end stretch petered out for me, while this season really didn't have any of that. And I'm just floored how high I am on this season after my lack of interest coming into it. And while I'll still go on and say it does suck that JLP wasn't here, which is some kind of charm that I was missing, I still enjoyed a lot of the gameplay from the players themselves. So yeah, a pretty top tier season in my mind, and definitely maintains AU's quality without losing any of it. Now to the next part, where in most traditions I'll be rating who I believe is the worst player of the season and the best player, and this one was tough, mostly on the best player side of things, but for the worst player, I think there was a definitive answer, and as much as I hate to say it, I have to say it's Kat, because quite frankly, she was in a really okayish spot, not really like in the center of her grouping, but at least she was pulled into one. And then she starts to blow that up at tribal at the last second, which ultimately leads them to just let her go. And honestly, it's really that egregious when she self-sabotages her position for no real benefit, just because she wants to make something chaotic, which, I mean, okay, that's good TV, but still. I think there was a better way she could have handled it. And while you could say Daniel is way worse as well, I wouldn't say his way of self-sabotage was as detrimental compared to Kat's spot, where she was basically switched to at the final minute due to her own unforced error. So with that, I think Kat is easily the worst player from this season. And now to the best player, and this is just all over the place on who my pick is, where maybe people may not agree with this because I'm not too sure who is, but I feel like it's all around based on everything. I feel like for me, I would have to pick Keely. Now, is she the most phenomenal player in the world? No, she has her flaws. But genuinely, I think of the players, especially in the end stretch, I think she has the least flaws with them. While I could say the Final Four outlasted her, they had their own issues that I can't even think is any better than her sort of gameplay. And also pretty close to picking Brooke, but I feel like Brooke has her own faults that were pretty much more damning than Keely, even though she kind of followed Brooke's footsteps of voting out someone who was easily a number for you. But then again, I just feel like of everyone, I think Keely easily stands out to me from a gameplay front. But there you have it. That wraps up my thoughts on this season of Australian Survivor. You know, it's really refreshing that we got 2 back-to-back seasons that are kind of redefining what good Survivor is. Especially coming out of the last year with US Survivor just not being the greatest in the world. And while I said earlier that I am liking 50, it is still having a bit of some tough roads that is making the experience a bit frustrating. So it's good to have a season like this to keep my investment within the Survivor world, and I look forward to see what they do next season. Anyways, that's all I gotta say. I appreciate you guys tuning in. I'm gonna sign off here. Gonna see y'all in the next video.